Welcome, everybody. We are thrilled to have a full house tonight. Come on in, guys. Come on in. Anybody with a Packer hat can come in and sit up front. We've got a couple spots over here if you want, or there's a few spots to fill in if you want. Anyway, I'm Sarah Hansen, the Executive Director of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, and here with me tonight is Dan Jones, our Creative Director, aka the photographer. We have been having probably more fun with a cemetery program than we should, because people don't always think about cemeteries as being fun, but they're fascinating, and there's something that's always been fascinating to me, and actually, clearly, some of you at least, who weren't dragged here by others. But we're also chuckling because Dan and I, we have a lot of this information, had a lot of this information anyway, but last week we went out and it was a beautiful fall day, and we decided it was a perfect day to go walking in the cemeteries. And so I would say that while we took almost 300 pictures just on that afternoon. And while we're not showing anywhere near that, we're doing just a sampling, I will warn you. But I'm sort of laughing as people who are coming in tonight, because I think probably 50% of you have someone we could have put in the program that are showing up in our cemeteries for sure. And so what Dan and I have decided actually is that this is not going to be a one-off kind of program. This is something that we will carry forward and do talk about different stories, because it's a great way to share some of those stories that are maybe lesser known or don't pop up in other ways. So with all of that said, we will go ahead and kick in, because I'm going to cheat a little, not cheat, but if we do have a Q&A session, a lot of Q&A at the end, I'm going to turn you over to Dan, because I have to admit I have tickets to the Minnesota United playoff game tonight that starts at 8 o'clock in St. Paul. So I'm here for the full show, but I may not be able to stick around a whole lot after that. But anyway, so with that said, we'll go ahead and jump right in. I do want to first acknowledge Ramsey County Library, the Ramsey County Library System, and the Legacy Amendment, the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, which helps fund programs like this for the library systems. And then, of course, the Historical Society members, because without our members and donors and supporters, we wouldn't be here at all, let alone able to do some of these fun things. So the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society covers, technically, our territory, if you will, includes the 5 municipalities that touch the lake itself. So Birchwood, Delwood, Matamidi, White Bear Lake, and White Bear Township. And within those 5 municipalities, there are officially 4 cemeteries. You might say 5 because Lakeview Cemetery has Evergreen Memorial Gardens as well, which is, I believe, a separate legal entity, but they're right next to each other down in the south part. But we'll talk about each of those areas. And like I said, a sample or two from each of the spots. One of the things I want to start with, though, before we get into the history of those particular cemeteries and some of the stones and individuals who are buried there, is kind of a sampling of cemetery symbolism in particular, because it can be really fascinating. And clearly, all of you are interested enough to be here. My family, I should take a picture of this, because my family would argue that every time I say, hey, there's a cemetery, we should pull over and see what's there. They cringe and groan and don't love that. So it's not just me. But this is at Union Cemetery, and it's one of my favorites. It's got a little damage. It's missing a panel, as you can see. But it has a tremendous amount of detail to it. I don't know who Willard, I don't know who the family is, I don't know who that represents. We'll have to dig. Well, not dig. We'll have to look into that. It's a horrible habit I have of saying we'll have to dig deeper into that or whatever. We don't break ground on anything, I swear. We'll not do it. But what I love about this particular example is we don't have, this is metal. We don't have a lot of metal monuments in our cemeteries here in Minnesota for a lot of reasons. You'll see these out east in particular. But this one has a lot of detail on it, and you can see just even the lettering and the numbers and things have a little more detail to them. But the wreath, that feeling of home, is an important effort to put into the symbolism, as well as the flowers. And then the urn on top is kind of the same thing. That's hospitality and home and being warm and comforting. And of course, we will show a couple other examples of that, but depending on the family, that's often an important element that they would put into a stone. Now, Harry, again, don't know anything about him. Poor Harry was only 10 or so. But I also find the simplicity of this stone beautiful. It's just really straightforward, and I presume he was in a family plot, and so the family name is in there somewhere. But it intrigued me, and the juxtaposition of the two is kind of touching, I think. So now you can imagine, as particularly in this area of the world, we have a lot of crosses, different examples of crosses that you'll see throughout, because we have a lot of Christians. Our cemeteries are primarily Christian. There are some Jewish cemeteries in the metro area, not in our four spaces, but or four cemeteries that we have specifically, but there are a lot of crosses, as you can guess, but different styles. Some are very simple, like that one we just saw. Some are much more elaborate or ornate with different flowers and different things. Some have a little bit more of a cultural piece to it, and angels and pieces there. And then we jump into, again, other symbols. The cross is pretty clearly Christian, but we jump into some other symbols that are more, again, decorative and elaborate and ornate. You'll see a lot of granite in our cemeteries up here in the Midwest because of the climate, and the fact that granite is readily available. Cold Spring granite up in central Minnesota is very, very popular for providing monuments and stones and things. You'll see a lot of softer stones, and you'll see some examples as we go, but you'll see a lot of softer stones that are the older stones, and then all of a sudden they'll be replaced by a more modern one because it has deteriorated and or broken. And unfortunately, sometimes you see vandalism and damage as well. So here's another example of an urn, just a very different style, large stone. Often a large monument like this with a surname is for the family plot, and then you'll see a lot of smaller stones on the ground or whatnot that are spread around. And this one was kind of a fun one. Again, I say fun a lot, but this one was kind of an interesting one because of its elaborate decoration to it. And I don't know if you can make it out, but it has German on it, and I actually translated it because German is not one of my skills. But I actually translated it, and it said, "Crying we lay down in your quiet bedroom. You will never come back to us, so we cry for you." So very, yes. So they didn't have, I don't know if we caught in the back if there was a name. Small, yeah. But it was very interesting from a symbolism standpoint. And so obviously these things hold a lot of meaning, as we all know. But and then some of the other symbols or other pieces, and we'll see a few different ones. This is Thomas Milner. As you can see, he was born in England in 1804. So this is an older grave. He died in 1887. But again, these columns on the side were the detail we were going for, as opposed to, he was one of our earlier settlers here in town. But it's really the columns that I wanted Dan to snag in the photo. And they represent strength and again, the home and substance. So kind of an interesting piece as you go along. Another urn, kind of hidden in the shadows actually, but giving that feel. And then here we don't have, if you've ever wandered cemeteries in Boston or Philadelphia or places like that, of course they have graves that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. We don't tend to, but we do have a few. This is Jacob Long, who died in 1862. He is the first burial at Union Cemetery, and we'll jump into that story in just a few minutes. But I find it interesting. In the Long family, actually, I'd have to double check the records now, but I'm guessing it's probably still true. The Long family has been a large family for many generations, and they have the largest plot in Union Cemetery as well. So Not shocking, but he is part of that. And you can see it's an older stone. You can actually see where it has cracked in the past and broken, and they repaired it. But what's interesting here is the draping, and I don't know if you can read it, but it says "Gone Home" on the top there, and then the finger pointing heavenward. So it's he's making sure. Yeah, it was exactly. He's making sure we know which way they went. I don't know. I don't know about that. But Mary was the wife of Jacob. She's also going home. You don't see the hand too often, particularly around here, but these two had it, and I thought that was kind of interesting. The next one here still has the same going home message, but has the dove, which can represent peace and all sorts of things, but similar ideas. And again, the earlier types of stones, another long. But doves are prolific, as you can imagine. They carry on through just about every Christian point of view, Christian cemetery, non-denominational cemeteries, you'll see them. They are very much, grace and peace and all of that. So they are pretty common to see. But this one was kind of interesting. It's a little different twist. I've got a couple other versions, but they tend to have what you usually see as the scroll of life, or to represent sort of the story of your life, and on and on. This one is all rolled up on the very top of the stone and buckled closed with a belt. So I'm not sure what that means, if that has a different meaning, or if it's something that was specific to that person in the sense of maybe they were a dressmaker or something. It's hard to say. Usually you see something like this, where you can see the scroll at the top and then down on the side. Jumped ahead on me. And then another variation of that is the tree of life, or a log, which will be cut off on the sides and cut short. Often they are simple like this, where they're just rounded pieces. Some are much more elaborate, like this, exactly, that have all sorts of symbolism entwined in with them. So you never know. Again, everybody has a different preference. And sometimes you'll find them on top of stones or other stones and pieces, like this one again in the Long. The Long family had a lot of examples, as you can imagine. And a variation of that, again, is having the rough top, not having that finished. It's sort of the life was cut short. It was not as long as they had intended. And then the Book of Life, same concept as the scrolls and things. Again, another long, but having that representation. And then, of course, the obelisk, which can take a lot of different meanings, but it has an Egyptian origin, but typically kind of replaced the idea of the pointing to heaven. It's aiming skyward and letting you know. And then on this particular one, it actually has a Masonic symbol, the Masons, and so that would indicate that this person was a member of the Masons. So, and then as we get into more modern symbolism, you will see some rings and things in earlier stones, but these typically show up in the last 50 to 75 years, either rings, individual rings, or intertwined rings. Praying hands, very common to be seen. And then you've got the cardinals, which are have kind of taken over in some ways for the doves. Cardinals and butterflies and dragonflies as symbols of remembrance and hints to folks. And then what I find fascinating is you can put just about anything on a stone these days, and this cracked me up. I love my Coca-Cola, but that cracked me up. I don't know that I love it enough to put it on my stone, but whoever, I don't know whose this is, but or why they picked it, but it had to mean something. So, and that's what's so interesting about cemeteries and stones, is that obviously you can find examples of just about anything. So with those in mind, we'll jump into our specific cemeteries. Our first cemetery that was established in the area is our Episcopal Cemetery, which is St. John in the Wilderness. This is located on, you can see it here, Not that this map is super modern and helpful, but it's located on White Bear Avenue and South Shore Boulevard at the corner there. And it's placed there, or it developed there, grew there, because that was the original site of St. John in the Wilderness Church. Today, the church stands, the current church stands and has stood for the last 100 years just down the street from where we are now. But it wasn't until 1874 that they moved this building, which once stood on the south side of the bay for about 13 years, 14 years, moved it across and put it over here on Clark. You can actually see, if you go into the church, it's hard to make out in the photos, but you can actually see the footprint of the church. So if you go in and you look for the large obelisk, there's a sign showing it. It is really cool. And it's a little bit tough to make out at first, but once you know what you're looking at, it's kind of interesting to see. So kind of fun. So as you can imagine, the church was built in 1861, originally built in 1861 in this location. And as was typical, the cemetery, the graveyard, started to develop around the church building itself, the churchyard. And so as time went on, they started to sort of fill in. And then, as I said, they moved the church itself in 1874 to the other end of town. And but the cemetery remained where it was. This is one of you, if you've come to programs where we talk about the resorts or talk about different folks over the years here in White Bear, this is probably someone you'd recognize. William and Agnes Leip are buried at the Episcopal Cemetery. The tree is encroaching and is staying there, or staking its claim, or however you want to look at it. But you can see their individual stones, fairly early burials in our community. William and Agnes were married and came. William, in particular, was a German immigrant. He came to St. Paul in 1846. He started dealing in cigars, and then invested in the ale business while he was out in St. Paul. And then by 1866, so just after the Civil War had ended, he came out to White Bear and bought one of the smaller hotels. Well, they were all small at that point, but bought one of the hotels, which was at essentially where Kowalski's and the shopping center is today, along that area, so not far from where the church was, and expanded it. He and Agnes owned it, expanded it. They went from a 10-room hotel to 103 rooms, and all sorts of other amenities, large hotel building, and then little cottages around. You can see this is basically the bay where the shopping center is, and then you can see Goose Lake across in the background there. They had the pavilion, the dance pavilion on the water, and all of the things. And so a significant impact on our community for sure. And so it's always nice to see that they're here for eternity, I guess, and able to stay and be part of the community as we go on. Another person buried in St. John's Cemetery is Hester Freeman. Hester was one of our earliest school teachers in the area. She's actually shown here in the center holding the book at a reunion with some of her students. And those are the students, so this tells you how much later it is. I believe it was a 55th reunion with the students, if I remember correctly, and she taught in the original log school that we had here. So if you can kind of envision that history carrying forward. Now, Hester was a Freeman. Her maiden name was Freeman, and she was connected through her family to Frank Freeman Farrar, who was also an educator in town. And for F.F. Farrar, which is not an easy thing to say quickly, but F.F. Farrar was started as the first principal of our high school, and then it was fairly quickly promoted to being our first superintendent of schools for the White Bear school system. So you see him on the left here. He had a home on Birch Lake. You can see him seated in the center there, and these are all teachers there. They were out at his home for a picnic on Birch Lake. So at probably end of the school year or whatever kind of celebration. But so a lot of interesting characters. Tom Varden, so this is a new one to me. It's not a new stone by any means. He passed away in 1938, I believe. But Tom Varden, it caught my eye, and I hadn't noticed it in the past. And that's one of the things that I love about the cemeteries is that it depends on how the light hits something. It depends on which area you happen to walk, on any given day or whatever. So you can find something new. It's, I'm sure, not coincidental that this looks like a trophy of some sort, because Tom Varden was the golf pro at the White Bear Yacht Club up until just before he died, until about a year before he died. And so he and his wife Minnie are buried there at the Episcopal Cemetery as well. And I didn't realize that he actually was there. He was part of the redesign of the golf course as well during his tenure. He was there, let me make sure I've got the dates right. He was at the White Bear Yacht Club from 1916 to 1938. And you can see him, this is not at White Bear, but you can see him during one of his times. In the clubhouse, this was during this era of the Yacht Club clubhouse, if you will. So kind of fun to be able to see what his world would have been. And then our final person at St. John that we're going to talk about tonight, and like I said, we could be here all night on any one of these cemeteries, we could do this for days. So I won't do that to you, but because this is only the first cemetery of the 4 we have to go through. And so the final one that I will point out is that of George Metcalf. And you can see the significant stones, the significant markers that we have there. Metcalf was an Episcopal priest who served as spiritual supervisor of Patton's Third Army, and was given the task of finding a prayer to ask God to clear the weather so Patton's forces could stop the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge. Metcalf then consulted with the head chaplain, James O'Neill, and together they melded Catholic and Anglican prayers to create one that was satisfactory to General Patton. And whether it was the prayer or happenstance, but of course the weather did clear, and we were victorious. So it's kind of interesting. You can see this is a close-up of one of those markers, but you can see that he served at Omaha Beach and certainly as the spiritual director with General Patton. So we have some, not just locally significant folks buried within our area. So Union Cemetery is the next oldest. As it says, it was officially established in 1877. But the earliest burial in the cemetery was that of Jacob Long in 1862, so 15 years or so prior to this. The cemetery initially, you can see it over here on the side, on the west side of the lake. So if you are, it's a cemetery that if you head out 96, head west on Highway 96 from Highway 61, you'll see it off on the south side of Highway 96. It was then when it was established, it was part of the William Weber farm, the family's farm. He owned most of the land over that way. And he allowed the Longs to bury Jacob there. And then by 1865, just a couple of years later, he ended up having to bury his first wife and 2 of their 3 sons. I don't remember what the epidemic was, but there was an illness that went through town, and he ended up burying them. And it was essentially then that he decided, okay, this is going to end up being a cemetery. They didn't formalize things at that point, but clearly they were gathering for that. And if you're on that edge of town or that part of town, you'll often see signs for Weber Street over near the Serenity Care Center and that sort of area. That is named for the Weber family, and that's William Weber Sr. you see there. He is buried in the cemetery as well, but the stone for his wife Amanda, who is the one who was buried in 1865, is more readable, more legible, locatable and legible, and so that's the one we have here to illustrate them. Also at Union Cemetery is the mass grave, the large grave in the southwest corner. So you can see the fences going there. That's Ramaley Park, if you're familiar with the park at all. But this is the remains that were exhumed from the largest of the burial mounds, the Native American burial mounds along Lake Avenue between Clark and basically Highway 61. They were reburied. The majority of skeletons, or the majority of remains, to form 19 skeletons were removed from the mound in the spring of 1889, in April of 1889. And when that happened, it had been very controversial back and forth. And the contents of the mound and the remains were shipped off to St. Paul on a train. And they were supposed to go to the Minnesota Historical Society at the time. The Minnesota Historical Society took the box of things that were in there, beads and other things, and said, we don't take human remains. We don't want those, and sent them back to White Bear, which led to a challenge, as you can imagine, of what to do. Two of the remains, two of the skeletons are reported, we can't prove this, but are reported to have been reburied on the property where the mound was, which is where the marker today is at Shady Lane and Lake Avenue along the lake trail. And the remainder were reburied here in the cemetery together. It's fascinating to me because the whole story goes on, and we literally have a presentation, an hour-long presentation that just talks about that story. So if you want to hear more, we can do that another night, but we can dive in more deeply. But this marker wasn't actually placed until the 100th anniversary of them being reburied, reinterred. So prior to that, it had been completely unmarked, and it wasn't until 1989 that they were marked. It's fairly quiet there right now. You can't see a whole lot, but often there are offerings left. The bench has been added over the years, and sometimes there are dolls or different toys or different things that are left symbolically. And I've spoken to many descendants, Native American descendants, who say that it's very meaningful to them to visit that particular site and be able to walk along the trail and where the mounds were, and then be able to go to the cemetery. And so it's, yeah. There's a few, yeah, there are a few things. Every time I've gone to this place, there's always some sort of offering there. Yep. And there's also a sunflower above, like a cloth sunflower above the stone. Okay. Yeah, and often another tradition is to tie fabric in the trees and things and around the fence. And so periodically there will be things out there as well. So this is a picture of the mound itself along Lake Avenue. And you can see, I mean, it was significant. There were 10 at one point that were mapped. This was the largest, and it was estimated to be about 20 feet high. So it gives you sort of a sense of what that would be, and about 80 feet long. And it would curve down or slope down along the lake bank down toward the water. So not far from, just across that southern end of the cemetery, across the little divider road there, is the GAR monument, the Grand Army of the Republic monument, that was put in by the American Legion post initially. And you can see the close-ups of a couple of the plaques and some of the other things. Dan was doing a fabulous job, and when I figured out I already had 83 slides for tonight, we decided we weren't going to add this in. Or not this is here, but we weren't going to add these pieces in. But we could actually do a program just on veterans, which we've done some in the past. But from the symbolism of the stones, the different branches of the service, men, women, different eras, different wars and things. And so it's kind of fascinating. And the GAR pops up in there, the text. But and these are actually the final members of the GAR, which would become the American Legion, or kind of evolve into. And this picture was taken, I believe, in the late 1880s. So this organization was formed after the Civil War as a veterans organization. These are the folks who are still around 20, 25 years later.
Sarah?
Yes?
The Gibbs that was mentioned there?
Yes.
Is that Gibbs related to the Gibbs in Roseville?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. The question is the post is named for E.B. Gibbs, and the question was if they were related to the Gibbs family in Roseville. Who has the Ramsey County Historical Society has the Gibbs farm. I don't know, but now I'm going to want to. now we have something to look into tomorrow, Dan. No, not like there's a shortage, but it's still good. All right, so the next piece, not quite as heavy as those couple of topics, but certainly those are important to mention. This one is someone we have a little more fun with. It's Harry Haugley, and some of you may know that name, but Harry Haugley was the band director for decades at White Bear High School, and I think there's somebody here with a White Bear Band jacket on that Dan was singling out earlier. But Harry Haugley made our band, was kind of the beginning of what White Bear Band was. And as Dan always teases me because he says, you really like Harry Haugley, and I do. But we also have a really nice picture of him, so that helps. There are several very nice pictures of him, but I love the story behind him. So first of all, he was a college friend of C.H. Christensen, who was our superintendent of schools at the time, and Christensen recruited him to come be our band director. We needed a band director in his mind. And so you can see the band here. Harry's sort of being cut off on the side here, but this is the band, and I love, I mean, some of them look like they're about 6, but they're there. And this is at the band shell in Railroad Park, right off the highway, right in downtown in the 1920s. What I like about this picture, and we have a couple others that I didn't throw in here, but what I like about this is that it wasn't just a school band. They were involved in all kinds of things. And so every community event it wasn't just school-related activities, but every community event there was, the band would be out there and he would be showing them off. And he was a wonderful promoter. He actually worked with the city council or the village council in the early years, city, very, very young city when it changed in the 1920s, to get a contract to give concerts in the park, Railroad Park along the highway there, on Friday, typically Friday evenings. And people would pull up with their cars and sit in the cars and listen to the music in downtown, which is kind of fun. One of the unusual things that he did, he had, of course, they were part of the Memorial Day parade that would march to Union Cemetery and all of that. He even got the band on WCCO for a little while on the radio. But his most, what I think is his longest lasting legacy is that in 1940, he wrote and presented the school song that they still use today, which is kind of neat. No?
They've got a new one when they recombine.
Aww. All right, well, thanks. Who invited you?
Sarah's good historic enough to know it yet.
Well, there we go. Thank you. That's true. I'm not up to on all the current events. So, all right. Well, for many decades then, from 1940 to last year. Yes.
Were girls not allowed to be in band?
They probably weren't. And it appears that they definitely weren't fighting that, at least not successfully. They were fairly quickly after this. This was in the 1920s, but that's a great question. I don't know when it changed, but I know by the 1940s they were. So, which actually is a fabulous segue. Thank you. I didn't plan to ask that question, but a fabulous segue to Miss Tiju, who is another character who's quite fascinating. She was another musician. She had a lot of stories, and we can't guarantee these stories, but she went on record many times telling them. But she had kind of a fascinating life. She claimed that her baby carriage, when she was a baby, that she rode in, was pushed on she was on a steamboat, traveling on a steamboat up the Mississippi River, and she claimed that Mark Twain spent much of the journey pushing her around the deck, Samuel Clemens. I don't know if that's true, but her family was friends with him, so it's possible, I guess. Her grandfather came to Minnesota in 1835 with some of the earliest waves of white settlers, and her mother, his daughter, was a doctor, a female doctor. So the interesting sort of kind of flip side of all of that, which was fairly rare. Ethel herself began playing piano when she was 3 years old, and gave her first recital at Hamlin University or Hamlin College by the time she was 4. So she loved piano. What I find intriguing is that, and it's always perplexed me, but Ethel lived basically a block to the north from the Philibrown house, the historic house that we have at the Historical Society, and was a contemporary essentially of Helen Philibrown, who lived in the Philibrown house. Helen Philibrown was a pianist, concert-trained pianist and piano teacher. Ethel gave piano lessons out of her house. They both were intrigued by preschools, nursery schools, and things, and children, and working with all of that. And both very active in their churches and involved in different things. So kind of an intriguing concept. And they actually taught together in St. Paul. They had a studio together in St. Paul for a while, and then when they ended up out here at White Bear, both were teaching out of their homes a block apart. So, but they were fast friends, and kind of intriguing. Unfortunately, we don't have a better picture. This is from a newspaper clipping, as you can see, and we don't have a better picture of Miss Tijoux, but her stories are certainly worth sharing. So our next cemetery then is St. Mary of the Lake. And it is the Catholic cemetery. So we've talked about St. John in the Wilderness, the Episcopal cemetery, and Union was non-denominational. It's a public cemetery. One of the things I should mention about Union is that people ask us all the time if Union is named Union because of the Union Army. And my answer is not that we know of. It did organically start to develop in the 1860s during the Civil War. But I don't think so. There are a lot of Union cemeteries around, and typically it means to be united, to be together. So I don't think so, but we don't have any evidence either direction on that particular one. St. Mary's is the Catholic cemetery, like I said, and has been located. That's the most north cemetery we have. It's on Stillwater Street, just east of Otter Lake Road, I guess, up that way. It was not, the church itself was originally built down kind of in town across the railroad tracks, but in town near where the original church, near where the school, Frazzati Catholic Academy, is today. We'll see a little picture of that in a second, but the cemetery, they needed more land, and so it didn't happen right away. The church was started in the 1880s, early 1880s, and then the cemetery actually didn't start until the 1890s. And some of the earliest, I have to share this, and you can't actually read the stone, but I threw it in there anyway. This is my great-great-grandparents, who were part of St. Mary's, founding St. Mary's, and the stone actually, this is my, I'm gonna guilt myself into doing this so that I can get a better picture, because it says Marcoux across the cross, and it is clearly not saying that right now. So I need to get out there and clean it, but they came to town in 1856, and what I think is fascinating, 1856, 1857 to St. Paul, and then out to White Bear. And what I find fascinating about the two of them is that he was an Episcopalian minister. He had a mission. They grew up in Philadelphia. He had a mission in Wisconsin, eastern Wisconsin, not too far from Milwaukee, and decided all of a sudden, after 5 or 6 years of doing that, that he was going to convert to Catholicism. Her family was not happy. They were already married. They were married, and they had 2 sons. They ended up having 3 more sons, but they were not. Her family was not pleased, and of course that put him out of a job, because you couldn't be a Catholic priest and be married, even if you could be an Episcopalian minister and be married. And so they ended up coming out to St. Paul and doing all sorts of things, and eventually coming out to White Bear. But his commitment to the Catholic faith was so strong that he actually used his cottage, and this is the cottage at Shady Lane and Lake Avenue. The core of the house still sits there today. It's been, of course, updated over the years, but he used his cottage as the site for the first masses, Catholic masses out at the lake. And so then when St. Mary's Church was created and built, organized and built, they built it on the the spot where part of the school is today, just across from where Birch Lake Avenue comes out to Bald Eagle Avenue, if that makes any sense at all. Pretty close, yeah. The cafeteria, what Dwayne is saying is the cafeteria is pretty close to where the church, the original church was. It's you'll actually see a picture. Well, here, we'll keep going a couple spots, because the next person you see is W.H. Jackson, who you see here. He was actually a big part of St. Mary's Parish as well. So as you can imagine, he's buried at the St. Mary's Cemetery. And he came to town in 1883. He was a contractor, and for a period of time, just about everything built in town was built by W.H. Jackson. And that included St. Mary's School. So this is the corner, if you will. This would be 2nd Street, and Bald Eagle Avenue runs in front. You can see where the original part of the school is. That building still stands, again, been remodeled and updated, but the original church then sat just to the south of the school building. Jackson was also, in addition to constructing the school, he constructed Beach School over off of Buffalo on the north end of town, and constructed a number of other buildings. But he also served as mayor of the village in 1907 and 08, and as an active city council member, or village council member through the years, and lots of other things as well. So for all of you hockey fans, this is probably a familiar name. Frank Xavier, or Moose Goheen, is one of probably the most famous and yet sort of hidden graves at St. Mary's. He is, or was, arguably our most talented hockey player to come out of the state of hockey. According to, and this isn't me saying this, although I like to claim him, but according to Roger Godin, who you'll see in a second, but Roger is the curator of the Minnesota Wild, and prior to that, he was the director of the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame. And I have to say that he has a bit of a crush on Moose Goheen. He was very impressed to find out when we first met years ago that I was from White Bear Lake. But Goheen was born in 1894 in St. Paul, but his family came out to White Bear pretty quickly. And he grew up learned how to play hockey on the ponds and the lake and whatnot around here, as you can imagine. And then he became a member quickly of the St. Paul Athletic Club team. I won't go through their whole history, but he helped lead the team to being the champs who won the McNaughton Cup, which was their trophy, in 1916 and 1919. But what I think is even more intriguing is that Moose then left. He enlisted in the Army and went and fought in the First World War. And when he came back, the team took him back right away. They said, "Yep, we want you." So they took him. The St. Paul Athletic Club took him back immediately, and he and several of his teammates from there actually went on to play in the first Winter Ice Hockey Olympics in 1920 in Antwerp, Belgium, and took the silver cup. Or took the silver medal from that. So Goheen, of course, it was a very different game back then than it is today. But this is Roger Godin, and this is actually a display that is still up at the Grand Casino Arena. I have to stop and think about what it's called now. Formerly the XL Energy Center in St. Paul, but Roger really likes Moose and likes to tell his story, so it's kind of fun to be able to see that. Yes?
One of the very first buildings at Hamline University in St. Paul was Goheen Hall. Do you have any idea?
Oh, interesting.
I would say that building was built in the 1870s, maybe.
Okay.
It hasn't been there for years now.
Yeah, I don't know. So the question was if the Goheen Hall at Hamline, one of its earliest buildings, is connected. I clearly have some homework to do coming from this section of the audience. I don't know, but that's another good story to chase down. They were from St. Paul. I mean, the family initially. So you never know. It would be interesting to see what we can find from that. I will say that Goheen was inducted into the Moose Goheen was inducted into the International Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto in 1952. He was only the second American to be honored in that way. coming in just behind someone a name you might know, Hobie Baker. And he was the first Minnesotan to get that honor. He was also among the first group to be enshrined at the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame in Eveleth in 1973. And it was just a few years after that, in 79, I think, when he passed away and was buried at St. Mary's. For those who may have kids or grandkids or family members or neighbors or whatever who play hockey these days, the annual tournaments at every level in White Bear, basically, well, the youth tournaments, are named the most Muscoheen hockey tournaments around town. So they try to keep his story alive that way. And then our final cemetery on the list in our area is Lakeview Cemetery on the south end. So you can again see we go from the far north to the far south. Lakeview is a non-denominational cemetery. It actually started when it first was organized or first began as a cemetery. It was part of the village of North St. Paul. That little blip was part of the village of North St. Paul down there at the very south. And then over time it organized as its own cemetery association, its own nonprofit organization. But the burial here, we saw some of the samples from the symbolism that we saw out there most of the examples came from Union Cemetery or Lakeview Cemetery because they are non-denominational. The Episcopal and Catholic cemeteries tend to have more kind of standardized stones and things, and they still have some creativity for sure. But this one is kind of interesting. So this is Tom and Winnie Stanek, and they were the owners. What most people will know them from, a lot of people will know them from, is that they were the owners of the Piccadilly restaurant for many years. So they married. They were both St. Paul Park, South St. Paul, kind of that area, in their late teen years, growing up years, and met and married, and then traveled all over. Tom was a truck driver and traveled all over, and they were living in Green Bay, Wisconsin in the 1960s, not far from what would be Lambeau Field. And Tom decided he didn't like traveling. He had 5 kids and wanted to be home more often. And so he decided that he'd try something new and came to Matamidi. They had family in the vicinity, came to Matamidi and talked to Art and Alice Cheesick, who had owned the Piccadilly for many years prior to that. And Art made a deal with them and said, yep, you can buy the restaurant. We want to retire. You can buy the restaurant. But here's the deal. You don't know what you're doing. And Tom said, you're right. He was a very humble guy in that way. And he said, you're absolutely right. And so they worked out an arrangement where Art would stay on for 3 months with him to help him, show him, how you order stuff, what you need to do, how to do any of this. And then they stepped back and moved on. I find it thoroughly entertaining because the Piccadilly started, some of you may have heard our stories in the past as a postcard aerial view of it at one point, but the Piccadilly started as a lunchroom just down the street in one of the buildings along the front in Willarney, and it was a counter, lunch counter kind of thing, just a little deli cafe kind of deal. And then in the 1950s, residents of Delwood invested and wanted a supper club at the lake, and so they did that and were able to get Cheesicks to put in a supper club along, which was really the front portion of the building. And then in 1972, the back was added where the banquet hall was essentially, or the extra party room kind of space. All of that, especially the first part primarily, was built on the foundation from the substation for the streetcar system. So there's just a ton of history kind of embedded into all of that, literally and figuratively. But over time, Tom and Winnie grew the restaurant, grew the business, and then their son Joe ended up taking over, and things changed hands a few times. And of course, now today on that site is a senior housing complex called Piccadilly Square in honor of the Piccadilly. So that is the formal end of the program, but I'm happy to try to answer questions or